Hi, welcome to Healing Tunes. Please watch the video. Today we are discussing the neuroanatomy spinal cord. These sessions we are discussing the position of the spinal cord, external features and internal features of the spinal cord. Next class we will discuss uh, spinal tracts and spinal reflexes. Spinal cord is the lower elongated part of the central nervous system. It is cylindrical in shape, slightly flattened anteroposteriorly and occupies the upper two-thirds of the vertebral canal. Spinal cord measures about 45 centimeter in adult male and 42 in adult female and the weight about 30 gram. Spinal cord extends as a downward continuation of medulla oblongata from the upper border of the posterior arch of first cervical vertebra to the lower border of the first lumbar vertebra. See the picture C1 to L1. First cervical vertebra to first lumbar vertebra is the spinal cord extends. Its lower tapering extremity is called conus medullaris. The apex of conus medullaris continues downwards as a thin thread like filament called phylum terminale. Spinal cord provides attachment to 31 pairs of spinal nerves, which connect it to the tissues, to the trunk, girdles, limb, and the viscera. Spinal cord contains large number of ascending and descending pathways, which serve as for nervous information passing to and fro between different parts of the body and the brain. This is the pathways. Stimulus or receptors is the sensory neuron is the ascending pathway. Then red color is the descending pathway. That is motor neuron pathway, and that is a response to effectors, effector muscles, organs, etc. Next is the functions of the spinal cord. Execution of simple reflexes is the first function of spinal cord. Then transmission of impulses to and from the brain. Next is the positional changes of the spinal cord. Up to the third month of intrauterine development, the spinal cord extends through the entire length of the vertebral canal and the spinal nerve passes through in the vertebral foramina at the level of the origin. Thereafter, the vertebral column grows faster than the spinal cord and the terminal end of the spinal cord gradually shift to the higher level. Consequently, at the birth, the spinal cord ends at the level of L3 vertebra, whereas in the adults, it terminates the level of lower border of L1 or intervertebral disc between the L1 and L2. The knowledge of these variations in the vertebral level of the lower end of cord is important to avoid injury to the cord while performing lumbar puncture, especially in children. See, at the uh, intrauterine development, lower end of the vertebral canal is the position, spinal position. Then at the birth, lower border of L3 vertebrae is the level. Then in adult, lower of L1 vertebrae. In between L1 and L2 is the position. Next is the spinal meninges. The spinal cord is surrounded by three protective membranes called spinal meninges. From outside inward, these are dura mater, arachnoid matter, and pia mater. Dura mater, the spinal dura extends from foramen magnum to the lower border of the second sacral vertebrae, S2. The space between dura and vertebral canal is the termed epidural space. This space contains loose areolar tissue, semi-liquid fat, and internal vertebral venous plexus. The space between dura and arachnoid is termed subdural space. It contains capillary layer of fluid. Next is the arachnoid matter. Arachnoid matter is a thin, delicate, transparent avascular membrane which invests the spinal cord loosely. Above it is continuous with the arachnoid matter of the brain, and below it extends up to the lower border of second sacral vertebrae, S2. Next is the pia mater. Pia mater is a thin, highly vascular membrane that closely invests the spinal cord and continues below the spinal cord as a thin thread-like prolongation, the phylum terminale. The subarachnoid space between the pia mater and arachnoid mater is filled with cerebrospinal fluid, CSF. Above it is continuous with subarachnoid space around the brain. Distal to termination of spinal cord, the subarachnoid space around the phylum terminale becomes roomy, forming a pool of cerebrospinal fluid called lumbar system. The lumbar puncture is done at this site to withdraw the cerebrospinal fluid. Next, we are discussing the external features of the spinal cord. The external features of spinal cord are the fissures and sulci, attachment of the spinal nerves, enlargements, and CAUDA equina. First, we are discussing the fissures and sulci. The anterior aspect of the spinal cord presents anterior median fissure and two anterolateral sulcus, whereas the posterior aspect present posteromedian sulcus, two posterolateral and two postero-intermediate sulci. The anterior median fissure is deep and extends along the entire length of cord. The anterior spinal artery runs in it. The posterior median sulcus is faint longitudinal groove from its floor. A septum of neurological tissue extend into the substance of the cord to a variety extent. The surface of the cord is divided into two symmetrical halves by an anterior median fissure and posterior median sulcus. Each half of the cord is further subdivided into posterior, lateral, and anterior region by the anterolateral and posterior sulci. The ventral root fiber emerges through the anterolateral sulcus at the dorsal root fiber of the spinal nerves, enter through the posterolateral sulcus. Next is the attachment of the spinal nerves. 31 pairs of spinal nerve emerge from the side of the cord. Of these, 8 cervical, 12 are thoracic, 5 are lumbar, and 5 are sacral, and 1 coccygeal. The cervical nerve leave the vertebrae canal above the corresponding vertebrae with the exception of 8th, which emerge between 7th cervical and 1st thoracic vertebrae. The remember spinal nerve emerge below the corresponding vertebrae. Each spinal nerve is attached to the cord by two roots, anterior motor root and posterior sensory root. The posterior root has ganglion which consist of pseudo-unipolar cells. Each of two roots is made up of number of rootlets that arise from the spinal cord over the certain length. The rootlets of posterior root enter the dorsolateral aspect of the cord along the posterolateral sulci, whereas the rootlets of anterior root emerge from the anterolateral sulcus or anterolateral aspect of cord opposite to the anterior gray color. Spinal segments. Like the vertebral column, the spinal cord is also segmented through the segments are not visible externally. The part of spinal cord to which a pair of spinal nerves, right and left, is attached is known as spinal segments. The number of spinal segments corresponds to the number of vertebrae in thoracic, lumbar, and sacral region, but in cervical region, one segment is more than the number of vertebrae. Whereas the coccygeal region, there is only one segment of 4 coccygeal vertebrae. Thus, the spinal cord is made up of 31 pairs spinal segments, 8 cervical segment, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal. The length of spinal cord, 45 centimeter, is smaller than the length of vertebral column. Vertebral column is 65 centimeter length. So the spinal segments are short and crowded, especially in the lower part of the cord. Thus, the spinal and vertebral segments do not lie at the same level. The spinal segments, as a rule, always lie about the numerically corresponding vertebral spine. In the lower part of the spinal cord, these lie well above the corresponding vertebrae. For example, the lumbar segments are related to the thoracic vertebrae. Approximate vertebral level attached to the spinal cord segments. Next is the enlargements. Enlargements in the spinal cord. Spinal cord is roughly cylindrical in shape with an average diameter of about 1.25 centimeter. However, opposite to the attachments of the nerve roots contributing to the formation of brachial and lumbosacral plexus. The spinal cord presents definite uniform swelling called cervical and lumbar enlargements, respectively. These enlargements are produced because of the presence of large number of large motor neurons in this region to supply the musculature of the upper and lower limb of the associated girdles. The cervical enlargement extends from C5 to T1 spinal segments, whereas lumbar enlargement extends from L2 to S3 segments. The vertebral level of these enlargements are quite different from these of spinal segments. That is, the cervical enlargement lie opposite C3 to T1 vertebrae and lumbar enlargement lies opposite T9 to L1 vertebrae. That is, cervical enlargement extend from C5 to T1 spinal segment, but vertebral level is C3 to T1. Same, lumbar enlargement extend from L2 to S3 spinal segments, but vertebral level is T9 to L1. Then cervical enlargement innervation is the muscles of upper limb and the associated girdles. But lumbar segments, lumbar enlargement muscles of the lower limbs and the associated girdles. Okay. Next is the cauda equina. Because the cord is shorter than the vertebral column, length and obliquity of spinal nerve root increase progressively from above downwards, so that spinal nerves may emerge through the respective intervertebral foramina. As a result, the nerve root of lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal nerve except L1 and L2 to coccygeal 1. From the caudal part of the cord, conus medullaris of both side take more or less a vertical course and form a bunch of nerve fibers around the phylum terminale called cauda equina. This name is called cauda mean tail and equina mean horse. So called because it is fancied resemblance of the tail of the horse. The cauda equina consists of the roots of the lower four pairs of lumbar, five pairs of sacral, and one pair of coccygeal nerves. See the picture. These are about the external features of the spinal cord. Next, we are discussing the internal structure of the spinal cord. The cross section of the spinal cord shows that it consists of an inner core gray matter and a peripheral zone of the white matter. First, we are discussing the gray matter. In cross section of cord, the gray matter is seen H-shaped, butterfly-shaped, flattened column extending throughout the length of the spinal cord. It is divided into symmetrical right and left comma-shaped masses which are connected across the midline by a transverse gray commission. The central canal of the cord passes through the central gray commissure. The canal is surrounded by the substantia gelatinosa centralis. The lateral comma-shaped mass of gray matter is further divided by the transverse gray commissure into the narrow elongated posterior horn and a broad anterior horn. In the thoracic region and upper two lumbar segments, a triangular projection just out from the side of lateral gray mass between the anterior and posterior horn. Nearly opposite to the gray commissure, it is called lateral horn. The posterior horn is connected to the surface by a gelatinous substance called substantia gelatinosa. The amount of gray matter and shapes of its horn and amount of white matter vary at different level. The amount of the gray matter seen at the particular level is well correlated with the mass of tissue it supplies. It is therefore maximum in the region of cervical and lumbar enlargements, which supply the limbs and their associated girdles. The horns are thus largest in the regions cervical and lumbar enlargements. The amount of white matter in the spinal cord undergoes progressive increase from below upward. This occurs due to the following facts. Progressively more and more ascending fibers are added to the cord below the upward. Number of descending fibers decrease in the cord from above downward as some of them terminate the each spinal segments. For this reason, the amount of white matter is massive in the cervical segments and very less in the sacral segments. Like in the other region of the CNS, the gray matter of spinal cord consists of nerve cells, neuralgia, and blood vessels. Neurons in the gray matter of the spinal cord, the nerve cell in the gray matter of spinal cord are multipolar and can be classified in the following two ways: structural classification and functional classification. Structural classification again divided into Golgi type 1 and Golgi type 2. Functional classification is the motor neuron, that's again divided alpha motor neuron and gamma motor neuron. Then second is the sensory neuron and third is the interneurons. First is the Golgi type 1 having long axon which leave the gray matter and either join the anterior nerve root or form the nerve tract. Second is the Golgi type 2 having short axons which do not leave the gray matter and remain intrasegmental or intrasegmental in position. Next is the motor neuron. These are present in the anterior and lateral horn. Types of motor neuron in the anterior gray column is the first is alpha motor neuron. These are large multipolar cells and supply the extrafusal skeletal muscle fibers. It's 25 or more in diameter. Next is the gamma motor neuron. These are small multipolar cells and supply the intrafusal muscle fibers of the neuromuscular spindle in skeletal muscles. This 15 to 25 in diameter. Next is the sensory neurons. These are present in the posterior horn and involved in relay of sensory information to the different parts of the brain, forming ascending tracts or to the other segment of the spinal cord forming intersegmental tracts. Last one is the interneurons. These are small neurons present throughout the gray matter of the spinal cord. These connect different type of neurons, hence also called association neurons. These are either inhibitory or excitatory and concerned with integration of segmental activities. Nerve cell groups in the gray column of the spinal cord is divided into cell group in the anterior gray column, second is cell group in the posterior gray column, and cell group in the intermediate or lateral gray column. Anterior gray column again divided into medial group, lateral group, and central group. Posterior gray column again divided into substantia gelatinosa, nucleus proprius, and nucleus dorsalis, and visceral afferent nucleus. Intermediate or lateral gray column divided into intermediolateral nucleus, intermediomedial nucleus. First one is the anterior gray column. Numerous groups of motor neurons are found in the cross section of anterior gray column, representing several longitudinally arranged columns of varying length. These are divided into three main groups: medial, lateral, and central group. First one is medial group. Extends along most of the length of the spinal cord and innervates the axial musculature of the neck and trunk. This is further subdivided into ventromedial and dorsomedial parts. Second is the lateral group. Confines the cervical and lumbosacral enlargements and supplies the limb muscles. Next is the central group. Form three definitive nuclei which are fairly localized. These are as follows: phrenic nucleus in the cervical region, extending from C3 to C5 segment and innervating the diaphragm. Next is the lumbosacral nucleus. In the lumbosacral region, extending from L2 to S3, accessory 11th cranial nerve. Nerve in the it lumbosacral nucleus is the L2 to S3 level. Its function is unknown so far. Third one is the spinal nucleus of accessory. That is the 11th cranial nerve. Nerve in the cervical region extending from C1 to C5 segment and giving origin to spinal root of accessory. Next group is the cell group in the posterior gray column. In posterior gray column, the cell group are arranged into the four longitudinal columns. From the apex towards the base, these are substantia gelatinosa, nucleus proprius, nucleus dorsalis, and visceral afferent nucleus. First one is the substantia gelatinosa, is situated at the apex of the posterior gray column and extended throughout the length of spinal cord. It is composed of small Golgi type 2 neurons. It receives the afferent fibers of the lateral division of the posterior nerve roots, conveying primarily the pain and temperature sensation. Some of these fibers synapse with the interneurons of substantia gelatinosa. Second is the nucleus proprius, is a group of large nerve cells situated anterior to the substantia gelatinosa and constitutes the main bulk of cells present in the posterior gray column. It extends along the whole length of the spinal cord and receives the fibers from posterior white column that associated with the sense of position and movement, 2-point discrimination and vibration. Next is the nucleus dorsalis. Occupies the medial part of the base of the posterior gray column, projecting somewhat into the posterior funiculus and extends from C8 to L2 or L3 segment of the cord and receives proprioceptive afferent, that is muscle and joint sense, and exteroceptive afferent, touch and pressure, from the trunk and lower limb. Next is the visceral afferent nucleus, is located lateral to the nucleus dorsalis and extends from T1 to L2 and from S2 to S4 segments of the cord and receives visceral afferent from dorsal nerve root. Next group is the intermediate gray column. The cells of the lateral gray column from two nuclei, intermedio-lateral nuclei, intermedio-medial nucleus. First is the intermedio-lateral nucleus. Extends from T1 to L2 segments of the cord and gives origin to preganglionic fibers of the sympathetic nervous system, which leave the cord along with the anterior nerve root. Next is the intermedio-medial nucleus. Extend from S2 to S4 segments of the cord and gives origin to preganglionic fibers of the parasympathetic nervous system, that is sacral outflow, which also pass out through the anterior nerve root of the corresponding sacral nerves. Intermedio lateral nucleus is the thoracolumbar outflow. Okay. Next, internal structure in the spinal cord. Next section is the white matter. The white matter of the spinal cord surrounds the central H-shaped mass of gray matter and mainly consists of nerve fibers, the large proportion of them being myelinated give it a white appearance. The types of fibers in the white matter. Functionally, the fibers in the white matter of spinal cord are divided into following three types: sensory fibers, motor fibers, and association fibers. First one is the sensory fibers. These include the central process of primary sensory neurons of the posterior root ganglia, which enter the spinal cord and ascend or descend for varying length. The ascending fibers from the nuclei of the spinal gray column, which convey sensory modalities to the higher centers. The motor fibers, these include the descending fibers from higher centers, supraspinal level, to the spinal cord, the nerve fibers of the anterior and lateral horn cells that go to the motor roots of the spinal nerves. Third is the association fibers. These fibers originate and end within the spinal cord, interconnecting the neurons of the same segment or of different segmental levels. In the white matter, division of white matter, in each half of the spinal cord, the white matter is divided into three parts called white columns or funiculae. That is the posterior white column, lateral white column, and anterior white column. Posterior white column between the posterior median septum and posterior horn. Lateral white column between the anterior and posterior horns. Anterior white column between the anterior median fissure and the anterior horn. Anterior white column are joined together by the white commissure. Each white column is made up of tracts which are ascending, descending, and intersegmental. These are about the spinal cord position and structures. Then next sessions, we are discussing spinal cord tracts and reflexes. Please subscribe the channel, like the video, and share it. Thank you for watching our channel.